Hello, and welcome to this three-part short video series on developing a sustainable financial plan for marine protected areas in Sri Lanka. My name is Eshal, and I will be walking you through the content of this video series. This series was developed by Center for a Smart Future under the project of Oceans 5 in partnership with Blue Resources Trust. This series complements our existing work under the same project, and we hope that the other videos will give you more context into what this video gets into. So we recommend watching these videos before, especially part 2 and part 3. This mini-series focuses on what we set out to do as part of this project in developing a sustainable financial plan for a specific protected area, being the VNR, the Vidataltiu Nature Reserve. Part 1 of this series will focus on what exactly a sustainable financial plan is, and the financial plan in particular that we have looked at being the conservation investment plan. Financial plans, put simply, are step-by-step processes which are usually documented that achieve one of two things. Firstly, it gives a clear picture of the financial needs. Secondly, it looks at potential revenue sources. Now, what exactly does this mean? This broad definition focuses on financial needs, which are effectively what you need money for, often outlined in a budget. And by potential revenue sources, we refer to how exactly that money is obtained and from whom. When we look at finances for conservation, it means looking at conservation outcomes and how exactly funding or finances can be channeled to meet those requirements. Often, this is done within a plan that already exists by a conservation authority. So, for example, in a protected area in Sri Lanka, where the conservation authority would be the Department of Wildlife, the financial plan should support the Department of Wildlife's conservation outcomes. So this gives the opportunity for the conservation authority, in our example, the Department of Wildlife, to ensure that finances meet the conservation outcomes that they wanted to achieve. So typically, a conservation authority would look at finance towards the end. What does this mean? This means that they would look in a protected area setting at stakeholder considerations, ecological value, and other such things, and while considering what needs to be done, then decide after a conservation strategy has been developed how exactly a budget and finances can fit in to meet these conservation strategy outcomes. So as this shows, conservation authorities typically work closely with stakeholders, understanding how exactly they interact with protected areas to decide what exactly the best course of action is to meet conservation outcomes. So for example, in a marine protected area, the conservation authority may decide that there is a problem of overfishing. In order to combat this problem, they may deploy activities that involve patrolling, monitoring, to ensure that certain requirements are met and that ecological outcomes are also ensured. To do this, the activities that I mentioned, such as monitoring and patrolling, they will then decide what the budget is and then decide how exactly funds can be found to meet these budgetary requirements. So therefore, such activities, such outcomes that they wanted to achieve are often considered a conservation strategy, and this is what is seen in a management plan or even an action plan. And therefore, as you can see here, once a conservation strategy is decided, financial needs or revenue needs are then decided, and this determines how exactly the conservation authority is going to go about finance, the financial plan. However, there is another way of doing things. Financials can actually be integrated earlier on and throughout the planning process. Increasingly, we can see this happen where conservation authorities, in fact, give due consideration to financial aspects throughout the whole process of planning and developing a conservation strategy. When developing a conservation strategy, they may consider things such as the cost of investment, the expected impact of that investment, the potential investors who can actually source funds and make sure that the financiers are attracted from the right places, financial options which look at solutions to problems that might be innovative and different, which we'll also cover, as well as the financial feasibility of the solutions that they decide. So all of this is actually considered when the Conservation Authority is going about their analysis phase, when they're talking to stakeholders, when they are conducting environmental assessments and analysis. They also pay attention to certain aspects that can feed in to financial information. What this leads to is a conservation strategy that has finance or a financial plan, in fact, embedded in it. So in our example of the marine protected area where overfishing was a problem, what this looks like is the Conservation Authority considering the impact on fishermen, looking at other revenue sources such as tourism, and in fact thinking of all these considerations when coming up with how exactly to deal with patrolling, monitoring, and the things that they wanted to set out in their conservation strategy. Here it's important to note three things. This is often an iterative process, given that ecosystems and protected areas are dynamic environments where factors change. It's important that conservation authorities also give due consideration to such changes. The other thing to keep in mind is that financial planning and the solutions that come from such planning aren't necessarily geared towards fixing problems. What this means is that you don't need an economic crisis, you don't need a funding gap to think about financial planning. Financial planning can be very much business as usual, as it's part of the conservation strategy that your conservation authority considers when trying to achieve the stipulated conservation outcomes. So having looked at how conservation authorities usually go about financial planning and how a more recommended, more modern approach to financial planning is, let's now take a look at a financial plan in particular, the Conservation Investment Plan. There are many types of financial plans for conservation, and all of these financial plans follow a very similar logic in their approach, where they first look at diagnosing needs, second look at identifying solutions, and then look at delivering sustainable outcomes. The financial plan that we will now look at, the Conservation Investment Plan, also achieves the same things with a few added qualities. So we chose conservation investment plans in this project because it is a simpler, targeted, and strategic approach which involves as much participation as possible in determining the best way to go about financing protected areas. Conservation investment plans focus on two main aspects. Firstly, communication, where it gives a clear picture of the financial requirements that need to be met to achieve these conservation outcomes. And secondly, where it communicates and justifies the conservation finance needs to a vast variety of stakeholders, including decision makers and potential funders. Conservation investment plans also focus on the practicality of execution, and this is done by outlining and identifying the potential funding sources as well as the actions required to overcome key financial constraints to effective management. So in order to develop the conservation financial plan that can be implemented in the Sri Lankan context, the example that we spoke of being the VNR, we looked at a few case studies that showed what exactly a conservation financial plan or a conservation investment plan encaptures. Firstly, we focused on the Hitamanthi Wildlife Sanctuary CIP in Myanmar. So this was Myanmar's first CIP where it decided what exactly needs to be done to broaden its financing base. This was a document that was used by government as well as other stakeholders to communicate these needs to ensure that this wildlife protected areas ecological value is properly conserved. We also looked at the sustainable financing strategy for Cat Tien in Vietnam. This plan identifies key conservation finance priorities and also makes links to new funding available. They also specified a roadmap in terms of implementation along an existing management plan.